someone's driving by and parking right in front of my house as I'm doing this in front of the big picture window, so that's fun. We need to talk about the Northmen. So this is going to be my modern Norse Pagan reaction video to the new release, The Northmen, which is a film by, I believe the director is Robert Eggers, and it stars Alexander Skarsgård and Anya Taylor-Joy, and it is basically a classic revenge story set in the Viking ages. So what I kind of just wanted to talk about in this film is not so much getting like too in-depth with the plot or the spoilers, but just the things that I picked out watching the movie in the theaters that I noticed from a Norse Pagan perspective and that I was able to just kind of point to and call out throughout the movie to be like, hey, I understood that reference. Because I feel like this movie was not at all what I was expecting just going into it, because just from, the trailers and everything that have been circling on the internet, I was just expecting a straightforward, like, violence and gore action film. And it is very much that, don't get me wrong. They are not shying away from the inherent violence in the Viking age. Come and see the violence inherent in the system. They're not shying away from that by any means, but I just kind of wanted to get into some of the other aspects of the movie that, because I feel like there were a lot of things in this film that if you were going into it, watching it from the perspective of someone that is just into Vikings or into action movies, and not necessarily someone with an interest in the paganism, heathenry, or even just like Norse mythology aspect of things, there's a lot that is just going to go over people's heads in this movie if you don't kind of know that background to know why some of the things are being shown in the film and why it's being presented the way it is. So let's get into it. First off, the thing that I really loved was just the opening shot of this film. It opens on an erupting volcano, and you hear this voice, this gravelly, almost throat-singing voice saying, "Odin, hear me." And it kind of serves as this very poetic introduction to the film, because not only, for me, does that image of the ash cloud coming forth from this active volcano bring to my mind imagery of Yggdrasil as being a tree of ash, and also just kind of a big symbol of like Ragnarok in general and the cycle of destruction. But it just sets this very powerful opening tone for the movie, especially with the narrator invoking Odin first off and saying, "Odin, hear me." It, to me, it just sets the tone that this is presenting a story, telling you a story, just like out of the Norse and Icelandic sagas. And it also reminded me a lot of what you'll see in a lot of the Greek epic tales, where the author or the poet will begin by invoking the muses and saying, like, "Hear me, grant me the divine wisdom, grant me the divine inspiration to tell this tale." And the story is laid out very much like a saga that you would see told back in the medieval and the Viking age, which is really what I enjoyed about this film, first and foremost, was just having that epic saga storytelling aspect to it. The story is based very loosely off of a tale outlined in Saxo Grammaticus's Deeds of the Danes, actually. So, and it's also the tale that serves as the basis for William Shakespeare's Hamlet. So you will notice that the main character in The Northman, Amleth, sounds like Hamlet. So that's where the story of Hamlet actually comes from. Now, as I said, this movie is only very loosely adapted on this story, other than it being, an uncle murdering a boy's father, i.e. Hamlet, and the son plotting his revenge. The version of the story in this movie then kind of diverts off on its own from there. So while this story has some of the similar plot elements from the Hamlet story, it, for the most part, is creating its own tale, kind of pulling from several of the Norse epics and sagas. So you'll see just kind of hints and elements from several stories in this one. The other thing it reminded me of a lot is we've actually been slowly going through the anime Vinland Saga, which is also a revenge story that starts off in Iceland, and in there the main character Thorfinn, his father is killed, and so he vows to get revenge on his father's killers, and also ends up kind of joining this band of reavers and raiders, much like the character of Hamlet does in the beginning of the film. That was also kind of interesting to me to see just, similar story elements that are contained in several of these Viking tales, all kind of condensed into one epic retelling of these similar types of stories. And to me, that was, like I said, that's kind of what makes this movie really interesting, and that I wasn't expecting going into it, is that aside from it just being a straightforward, like, blood and guts action film, there are a lot of elements in this movie of magic realism, where you're seeing this magic and these things happening that aren't realistic to everyday life. You're seeing the presence of the gods actively working and being present in the characters' lives. The characters themselves are having visions, seeing prophecies. And one thing that I found was interesting is I found this article from the Smithsonian where they were interviewing the director of the movie and talking about the tone and what he was trying to go for with this film. And he said that that's definitely what they were trying to achieve by incorporating not only the realism with the aspects of showing the Viking raiders being very violent and showing that Viking society was often based on things like slavery and the slave trade, and while also not shying away from those aspects of the society, it also does a really good job of incorporating those magical, surreal, almost supernatural elements in a way that still feels native to the stories and feels natural to the settings, because as the director said, his goal was to create a tale that would have been recognizable to the storytellers and the audiences of that time period. And in the day-to-day life and in those stories, especially with Saga of the Volsungs and things like that, Odin and the gods take an active interest in people and their lives and their destinies, and characters like Hamlet often see their wills and see their signs and their workings and receive visions and prophecies in their journeys and in their life. So I was not really expecting going into this movie to see it incorporating a lot of that, but I enjoyed those kind of magic realism aspects that were featured in the films. One of the things that I also made note of, speaking of Saga of the Volsungs, is that at the beginning of the film, which shows kind of Hamlet going through this coming-of-age ceremony. So one of the first things that I also noticed, to go back to what I was saying about it containing aspects from things such as the Saga of the Volsungs, was that in the beginning of the film, when you're seeing Hamlet and his father, along with this jester / soothsayer character of Willem Dafoe, and Hamlet is going through this coming-of-age ceremony with his father, where they go to this chamber behind an Odin totem, and he basically takes some psychedelic mushrooms, and they're acting like wolves throughout this ritual. This, to me, really reminded me of a section from the Volsung saga, where one of the characters, I think it's Siegfried and his son Sinfjotli, but yeah, two of the main characters, a man and his son, end up coming across these wolf skins while they're kind of hiding and living in the forest, and literally skin change into wolves, and they spend some time as wolves, but that wolf instinct almost starts to overtake their rational human mind, and they end up almost killing one another. So it kind of harkened back to that to me, seeing that scene in this film, where they're basically skin changing into wolves with the assistance of some psychedelic drugs. And then he's also tested and put through kind of an ordeal. And I think during this scene, we also, if not this scene, then definitely other scenes throughout the movie, I did notice that we actually see parts of the Havamal quoted. And not only do we see Odin featured in this film, we see his ravens, or two ravens, accompanying the main character Hamlet through several scenes in the film. We catch a couple little glimpses and hints at Odin himself. And then we also see that Hamlet's rival, his uncle Fjolnir, when he moves to Iceland and becomes just kind of a minor lord and farmer there, his main patron god is Freyr. And I don't know if that's because he's just kind of taken up farming as his main profession or what, but we kind of see almost this rivalry between two patron gods and their humans that they're backing, like Freyr versus Odin. In my mind, as someone who kind of works closely with the Vanir, Fjolnir is talking all about how like Freyr's on his side and Freyr's gonna avenge him, and I'm just like, dude, have you even met Freyr? It doesn't seem like kind of his thing to me, but I mean, I didn't live back in those days, so what do I know? I thought that was interesting, along with like the mushrooms and the skin changing. We also do later kind of see this very intense primal berserker ritual that the grown Alexander Skarsgård character is undergoing before a battle, and I thought that was interesting to see. The kind of priest or shaman, like Odinic figure that's leading the ritual, is wearing this horned helm. While, the horned helmets aren't really super accurate as far as, like, Viking battle gear goes, we do see that image of, like, the horned lord or lord of beasts or just kind of a shaman figure wearing a horned helmet like that depicted in several archaeological finds, so I thought that was kind of interesting. Another thing that many people take away from this film is it's very violent and gory, and I think that the director is definitely, like I said, making a point of not shying away from that, because at the beginning of the film, you're seeing Hamlet as this character who's joined just this group of raiders and just following orders, and it's really hard to sit and watch some of the things that these people do when they're doing their pillaging and their raiding, but that was the reality of life and of the Viking profession back then. And, we want to see them all nowadays as these noble, heroic figures who have the gods on their side and things like that. But I think it does kind of make a good point, and as it's quoted in that Smithsonian article, that's what they're going for, is that he doesn't want the main characters to come across as role models or just strictly heroic, or just strictly like good versus evil, protagonist, antagonist. He says that especially with those harsh scenes of the violence being perpetrated against people by the Vikings, is that like no one should come away from that scene feeling proud of that moment and wishing they were a Viking. And I think it's also kind of meant to spurn the character of Hamlet forward into leaving that behind and going to kind of take up something that's a little bit more noteworthy and deserving of honor and glory than pillaging random villagers, if you know what I'm saying. So, yeah, I think that the movie is violent for a reason and doesn't shy away from that for a reason. It kind of wants to build on those gray areas of nothing is ever just black versus white. And so those concepts are definitely presented further on in the story as the film goes on. These are my notes, by the way. I had kind of hastily scribbled down some notes while I was reflecting on the movie after watching it. And then, as you can see, the cats decided to spill water on it. So we'll see if I can still make sense of it here. Another thing that I really liked, along with Hamlet, the main character, I would say one of the other main characters in this film is Olga, Anya Taylor-Joy's character, who's kind of set up as the romantic interest during the film, but she is definitely a powerful character in her own right. She ends up as a fellow thrall or slave with Hamlet, and they kind of end up becoming allies and helping each other in their circumstances. And her full name apparently her character's name is Olga of the Birch Forest, and she is called a Slavic from Eastern Europe, or the land of the Rus, or modern-day Russia. where the characters kind of first meet each other before going to Iceland. And what was interesting to me is that along with seeing the Odin featuring heavily in this film, her character worships a nameless earth goddess, which could have been very much like Nerthus. And I thought it was also interesting that she was called Olga of the Birch Forest, and there were a lot of like Germanic and like continental pagan earth goddesses, but also very specifically birch goddesses like Berchta. So that was a cool little nod, and she also kind of performs acts of sorcery or witchcraft, if you want to label them that, almost like a vulva or a practitioner of such magics would. She's a little bit less on like the prophecy side of things. I think that's where we more see Bjork's character featured as that priestess / Norn prophetess in the film, but Olga's character does things more like potions and brews, which you will see made reference to a lot, especially in Saxo's History of the Danes. I was surprised so far reading through those stories how often there are sorceress women mixing like spells into the mead, or like spells and things or potent mixtures into the food and giving it to heroes to either help or hinder them. So it was also cool to see some of that element featured in this. Again, we see the magic mushrooms come into play with her, and this time she causes people to have a very bad trip with those. But again, it kind of incorporates those aspects of magic realism where characters are receiving visions and prophecies, and adds to that sense that this is a saga that would have been told during those times where magic and the gods were just seen as a part of everyday life and part of society. Like, it's not the thing that I always say about Norse paganism, it's not so much a religion, it's just a way of living. And so we also see things like fate and the Norns being driven home as a big concept in these characters' lives. I thought it was also interesting that when he meets that kind of prophetess, seer character of Bjork, I couldn't figure out at first, but she was holding something in her hands in that scene that was making a weird sound. And I realized later that it was actually a spindle, something where you hold the thread, and it's a drop spindle where the weight of it will spin the thread. And so, yeah, like it ties back to that concept of the Norns spinning out everyone's thread of fate. And you'll also see his mother character throughout the film pictured with a loom or next to a loom that she's weaving on. So it also kind of, just ties in that concept of the threads of fate, weaving everyone together into the tapestry of the web of weird. And then another big thing along those lines that I wanted to definitely point out and make reference to is that they even included later on in the film, Alexander Skarsgård's character meets up with this kind of hermit shaman living alone in a cave, and he goes out to him to seek a magic sword, which kind of to me harkened back to the tales of like Svipdag and the like, where he has to go seek the magic sword in order to slay his enemies. But what was even more interesting and of note in this scene particularly is that the Seder shaman is actually wearing female garb. He's wearing female clothing. You'll notice he's wearing an apron dress with the two big metal brooches on the side that keep it pinned, and that is traditionally women's attire. And then also in between his legs, you will notice he was holding the iron staff, which often also looks like a distaff or a spindle, which would have been carried by vulva or practitioners of Seder. Because Seder, as we know, was considered to be women's magic, and so there's even references made in some of these sagas and the Eddas to, like, I think specifically in Lokasena, Loki taunts Odin himself, for practicing women's magic, and that during the time when he was learning that craft, he wore women's clothing while he did so. So I don't know if having to dress as a woman was part of being able to even practice or partake in that craft, but I thought that that was really cool, a really cool historical reference that you will see in the Eddas and even made reference to with Odin himself being such a shaman who would sometimes dress up in women's clothes to practice those particular form of women's magic. And then the other thing during that scene was that he was talking to a preserved head, which also harkens back to the tale of Odin, where he eventually is sent back Mimir's head. Mimir was sent to the Vanir as a hostage as part of the peace treaty to end the Aesir-Vanir War, but they apparently weren't really happy with Mimir's job performance, so they cut off his head and sent it back to Odin, but Mimir was so wise, and his head would have supposedly contained so much knowledge that Odin actually ended up preserving it and supposedly being able to still go back and consult the head for wisdom. So I thought that was also an interesting reference made there. And then kind of the other two things that I really liked about the film was that there's not a lot of dialogue, but what there is, well, not exactly like flowery and very elaborate language. It's not Shakespearean language exactly, but it does have this very like serious, poetic tone to it almost. Like the characters don't say much, but when they do speak, what they say it matters. It's very important. And that also, to me, added to the tone of it being like a saga or a story being told by a skald or a poet. And then kind of my other takeaway from this film, really, that I just kind of wanted to point out is being very accurate from what we know from other epics, such as the Saga of the Volsungs, and, even maybe in your own modern-day personal workings with Odin the Allfather especially. If there is one thing that I took away from this film and from many of the tales like it is that Odin is a very harsh taskmaster. Odin is definitely seen throughout the film to kind of be on Amlet's side and be kind of watching over him and be the one spurring him to fulfill his oaths and fulfill his destiny, if you will. But if there is one thing we know about Odin, it is that Odin is also a very harsh taskmaster. He doesn't exactly care about the well-being of his chosen. He's kind of a man with his own mission. He's forging elites for Valhalla. Like, he's got a one-track mind when it comes to that. So, in a lot of cases, that does mean putting his chosen people through a crucible in order that they will be forged out the other side as the strongest warriors possible. Because that's definitely where we see more of the elements in the film coming into play as far as victory or Valhalla, being sent to Valhalla, and that kind of being a goal of several of the characters, and especially I think Hamlet, is he going to choose his destiny and be able to join the Einherjar in Valhalla, and while that might be the ultimate goal in the end, it doesn't necessarily equate to a very happy ending for the person that is able to get there, because Odin has his own objectives and his own goals in mind, and to that end, he has definitely been known to give his followers assignments. Kind of more like, if you want to work with Odin, keep in mind that you may also end up working for Odin. In the Essential Asatru book that I just finished reading that we'll be discussing for the book club coming up, I think next week or the week after, that is Odin one of the more popular gods back then and today just because he was the biggest deal, the biggest name, or does Odin attract so many people because he is the one out there most actively recruiting followers? Because sometimes that definitely is what it feels like, is that, there are definitely gods that you approach and want to work with and might ask to work with, and then there are some, in some cases with Odin especially, he wants you to work for him. So that's really all I kind of had to touch on as far as talking about the Northmen. I really enjoyed just the more magic realism aspects incorporated into the film, and as far as, it was kind of interesting as far as the film being kind of gory and violent, especially with, Hamlet being on this revenge quest and the things he has to do to get there. And it's very like almost Count of Monte Cristo, with he's like gonna kind of play with his enemies before he gets his ultimate revenge on them. But at the same time, when I did go back to read the story in Saxo Grammaticus that Hamlet and everything and all of this is based off of, it does say that, yeah, like the uncle killed his dad, and instead of fleeing, Hamlet, or the Saxo's Hamlet, stays in the court, and much like the Hamlet version of the story, kind of feigns being crazy, so that people will underestimate him and he can kind of stick around and keep an eye on his mom. And I feel like in this movie he kind of does that at first, like pretends to just kind of be a big stupid slave in order to get closer to his enemies. But after that, he just kind of goes all out and starts being like pretty heinously violent as far as exacting his retribution. But when you actually go read the Saxo story of the tale, that version of Hamlet does some pretty crazy shit in there too. So it's pretty wild. Check it out. And I also want to make note that I have a copy. Let me go grab it. Yeah, I did want to point out also that if you are looking to read the original story that this is loosely based on, or that Hamlet was based on, it is, like I said, contained in, I believe, book 3 of Saxo's History of the Danes. And then I also found that there is a version in this book, Teutonic Myth and Legend by Donald Mackenzie. I've really enjoyed this retelling and compilation. He has the retellings and compilations of all the Norse myths from the Eddas, as well as Beowulf and the Saga of the Volsungs. And in here he also includes a couple retellings of stories from Saxo Grammaticus, including Hamlet. So if you're looking for kind of a little bit more easier to digest version of that story, you can look here. There is also a free version on sacredtext.com, because they do not call Saxo Grammaticus for nothing. It literally basically translates into wordy as fuck. Trying to digest all of Saxo himself can be a bit of a daunting task even for me. But yeah, I'm gonna leave that off there. I just figured I'd leave you with these little tidbits that I noticed while watching the film. I just kind of wanted to get to geek out with you guys here over the things that I noticed watching this film that really stood out to me as being references not only to the sagas of the Norse, but also the stories and the myths and the magic and the paganism and pagan beliefs behind it as well. So just little things that I was able to kind of note and appreciate while I was watching. I hope that you appreciate watching this and that it was fun and informative for you, and until next time, stay classy, pagan.